Don Rickles built his entire career on a simple but audacious premise. No one was off limits. Politicians, world leaders, movie stars, and ordinary audience members alike were all fair game the moment he stepped onto a stage. His sharp tongue could reduce the most powerful men in Hollywood to tears of laughter, and yet behind the curtain of his celebrated comedy, there was one person who got under his skin in a way no joke could fix. Unlike Frank Sinatra, Johnny Carson, or Ronald Reagan, all of whom embraced his roasting with open arms, this one man never cracked a smile, never flinched, and never played along. For Rickles, that silence became the most haunting frustration of his career. That man was Denzel Washington. To understand why Washington's stoicism affected Rickles so deeply, you first have to understand how Rickles' comedy actually worked. His act wasn't built purely on insults, it was built on reaction. He needed eye contact, nervous laughter, a smirk, or, at the very least, a playful pushback from his target. The insult itself was merely the spark. The real payoff came from the shared acknowledgement between comedian and subject that it was all in good fun. Without that unspoken exchange, the joke simply hung in the air with nowhere to land. With almost every celebrity he encountered, Rickles got exactly what he needed. Frank Sinatra, widely considered the most feared and powerful man in Hollywood, roared with laughter when Rickles roasted him. Johnny Carson doubled over during every Tonight Show appearance. Ronald Reagan leaned into the humor with the ease of a man comfortable in his own skin. Even tough guys like Clint Eastwood played along, but Denzel Washington was a different story entirely. Washington carried himself with a nearly unshakable dignity, both on and off screen. On film, he radiated authority. In person, he projected the same intensity, focused, serious, and utterly untouchable. For Rickles, attempting to joke with Washington was, as insiders described it, like trying to tell jokes to a monument. Washington's face never budged. No smirk, no chuckle, no indulgence. Just a calm, piercing gaze that gave Rickles absolutely nothing to work with. Those close to Rickles recalled that he tried repeatedly to get Washington to crack at industry events, in green rooms, and during chance encounters at Hollywood functions. He fired some of his sharpest material in Washington's direction. On one occasion, he reportedly quipped, "Denzel, loosen up. You're making Mount Rushmore look like it's in motion." Washington's expression didn't change. For a man who had made presidents laugh and charmed the most guarded figures in entertainment, this was not merely frustrating. It was, by all accounts, genuinely infuriating. Over time, what began as professional irritation became something more personal. Friends who knew Rickles, noticed a difference in how he spoke about Washington compared to his other famous targets. When he mentioned Sinatra or Eastwood or Reagan, there was always that familiar twinkle, the casual affection disguised as venom that was his trademark. But when Washington's name came up, something sharper and more dismissive crept into his voice. It was laced with what those closest to him described as genuine dislike. Here was a man who had built his entire identity around not taking things personally, and yet he found himself quietly stung by one actor's refusal to engage. The irony was that Washington never tried to provoke Rickles. He was simply being himself, serious, private, and respectful in his own dignified way. But to Rickles, that consistent composure felt like rejection. Not of the jokes, but of him. And that cut far deeper than any public criticism ever could. For Rickles, comedy was never just entertainment, it was connection. Through laughter, he crossed social distances, punctured Hollywood's most inflated egos, and turned strangers into friends. When Washington declined that invitation, Rickles felt something almost sacred had been violated. Before Don Rickles became the fearless insult comic who could bring presidents and mob bosses to their knees with laughter, he was simply a kid from Queens with a quick tongue and a restless ambition. Born Donald J. Rickles on May 8, 1926 in Jackson Heights, New York, he grew up in a modest Jewish household. His father, Max, worked as an insurance agent, while his mother, Etta, devoted herself entirely to raising Don. It was Etta who played the most formative role in shaping his personality, encouraging him to think beyond the cramped apartment they shared and nurturing the spark that would eventually ignite his extraordinary career. As a boy, Rickles was sharp, curious, and deeply impatient with limitations. He discovered early that humor earned him more attention than anything else. Wisecracks in class frequently landed him in trouble, but they also made him enormously popular among classmates who admired his lightning wit. Even then, he displayed flashes of the sarcastic genius that would one day define him. His mother recognized that his humor wasn't mere silliness. It was a defense mechanism, a survival tool in a neighborhood where quick thinking could be just as valuable as physical strength. After high school, Rickles set his sights on acting. He enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, fully determined to be taken seriously as a performer. Broadway was his dream, perhaps Hollywood dramas with Shakespeare and prestige roles somewhere in his future. Comedy was never the plan, but during early stage work, he found himself filling awkward pauses with improvised quips, and to his surprise, audiences consistently laughed harder at those unscripted moments than at anything written in the script. Fate, it seemed, was pulling him toward a different path. World War II interrupted everything. Rickles enlisted in the U.S. Navy and served aboard the USS Cyrene in the Pacific. The experience toughened him considerably, but it also deepened his appreciation for the power of humor in dark moments. In genuinely perilous situations, he discovered that joking with fellow sailors relieved tension and created a remarkable sense of camaraderie. His sharp comments became a unifying force rather than an offense. That lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. When the war ended, Rickles returned to New York, ready to pursue show business. Acting jobs were nearly impossible to find, so he began working the nightclub circuit. His early act combined dramatic monologue with occasional wisecracks, and it largely bombed. Then one night, responding to a heckler, he fired back with a cutting remark and the crowd erupted. In that moment, everything clicked. Audiences didn't want rehearsed lines. They wanted that precise, unscripted voice that reached right through them and made them feel genuinely alive. By the early 1950s, Rickles had fully transitioned into insult comedy, a genre that barely existed at the time. He didn't use traditional setups or punchlines. He simply walked onto a stage, surveyed the room, and went straight for the jugular, mocking haircuts, dresses, and anyone unfortunate enough to catch his eye. No one was spared, and yet somehow his barbs felt affectionate rather than cruel. People left his shows feeling strangely flattered by having been targeted. That delicate balance became his trademark, and audiences couldn't get enough of it. The title Mr. Warmth, deeply ironic given his merciless stage persona, captured the paradox perfectly. He fired shots at people because he liked them, and the more vicious the shot, the more they loved him for it. By the mid-1950s, Rickles had carved out a reputation on the East Coast nightclub circuit, but Hollywood still felt like a distant mountain. The turning point came through the most unlikely of friendships with Frank Sinatra himself. When Sinatra attended one of Rickles's shows in Miami, Don didn't hesitate for even a moment. Looking directly at the most powerful man in the room, he cracked, "Make yourself at home, Frank, hit somebody." The audience froze. Then Sinatra roared with laughter. That single moment changed the trajectory of Rickles's entire career. Sinatra loved him. He respected Rickles's guts, admired his nerve, and from that night forward became his greatest champion, bringing him to shows, introducing him to celebrities, and defending him against critics who found his act too abrasive. Sinatra's approval became Rickles's passport into Hollywood's most exclusive inner circle. Television quickly amplified his reach. Regular appearances on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson turned him into a national phenomenon. Unlike most guests who arrived with carefully rehearsed stories, Rickles walked on and created pure chaos, roasting Carson, mocking the band, taking shots at celebrities in the audience, and leaving the host doubled over in genuine laughter. Ratings spiked whenever he appeared. The Dean Martin celebrity roasts elevated him further, giving him a primetime platform to dismantle Hollywood royalty in front of millions of viewers. To be roasted by Don Rickles was considered a badge of honor, evidence that you had truly arrived. He also proved himself as a versatile actor, holding his own alongside Clark Gable and Burt Lancaster in the 1958 drama Run Silent, Run Deep, and delivering strong comedic work opposite Clint Eastwood in Kelly's Heroes in 1970. By the mid-1970s, he even starred in his own sitcom, CPO Sharky, playing a Navy officer whose bark and sarcasm suited him perfectly. Through every reinvention, one thing remained absolutely constant: his authenticity. He never softened his act to please critics, never impersonated anyone else's style, and never apologized for his art. That refusal to compromise is precisely what made him timeless. For a man who made his name publicly tearing people apart, Don Rickles' private life couldn't have been more different. Behind the biting, Whit was someone who craved stability, warmth, and genuine loyalty. He found all of that in Barbara Sklar, the woman who became not just his wife, but the true anchor of his life. Rickles was already in his late 30s when they met, unusually late for marriage by the standards of his generation. Friends had long teased him about being a confirmed bachelor, convinced his sharp tongue had scared off any serious romance. But Barbara was different. She wasn't dazzled by his fame, nor particularly charmed by his constant wisecracks. In fact, Rickles later admitted that one of the things that most intrigued him was that she hadn't laughed at his jokes when they first met. For a man accustomed to commanding every room with laughter, her composure was irresistible. They married in 1965, and unlike the controlled chaos of his career, their marriage was defined by steadiness. Together, they had 2 children, Mindy and Larry, both of whom pursued careers in entertainment. At home, Rickles revealed an entirely different side of himself. The merchant of venom was affectionate, sentimental, and fiercely protective of his family. He spoke of Barbara with deep reverence, calling her his confidant in a business notorious for inflating egos and destroying marriages. In 2011, tragedy struck when their son Larry passed away from pneumonia at just 41 years old. For a man who had dedicated his life to making people laugh, losing a child was a wound that never fully healed. In interviews after Larry's death, whenever the subject arose, Rickles' characteristic wit gave way to quiet, unmistakable grief. It was a powerful reminder that beneath all the laughter lived an ordinary father who hurt just like everyone else. In his grandchildren, Rickles found unexpected new joy in his later years. To them, he wasn't the roast master of Hollywood or the king of Las Vegas. He was simply Grandpa Don. They knew him less from late-night television and far more as the voice of Mr. Potato Head in Pixar's beloved Toy Story films. Rickles would joke that after 50 years of relentless work, the only thing his grandchildren cared about was that he played a talking plastic potato. Secretly, he loved every moment of it. Don Rickles' final years were, by the standards of his turbulent career, surprisingly calm. He continued performing well into his 80s, though the pace gradually slowed. The smoky nightclubs and Vegas residencies gave way to smaller appearances, intimate interviews, and more time at home with Barbara. The merchant of venom spent his twilight years less defined by bitterness than by quiet reflection and deep gratitude. His health declined in the years before his death, with kidney troubles weakening him considerably, yet his wit remained razor-sharp until very nearly the end. When asked at one of his final public appearances about retirement, he replied with characteristic deflection, "Retire? To do what? Sit home and stare at the walls? My wife won't let me. She likes me out of the house." Even at his most vulnerable, laughter remained his native language. Don Rickles died on April 6, 2017, at his home in Century City, Los Angeles. He was 90 years old. Tributes poured in from comedians, actors, politicians, and fans around the world, not just celebrating his fearless humor, but the unmistakable warmth and love that powered every insult he ever delivered. He was laid to rest at Mount Sinai Memorial Park in Los Angeles, a city he had made laugh for over half a century. His legacy is one of remarkable contradictions held together by genuine humanity. He was the man who insulted everyone because he cared deeply about connecting with people. His so-called hatred for Denzel Washington, born of frustration, wounded pride, and perhaps a bruised ego, was Ultimately, just one quiet note in a 7-decade symphony of laughter. Don Rickles proved, night after night, that an insult delivered with the right heart could also be the deepest kind of love.